Good morning, world. Cece here. Today's podcast is going to be a little different. Over the past several months, some of you have been listening to my podcast, Cece Talks Live. And we've talked about fear and happiness, the subconscious, emotional intelligence, trusting yourself, becoming the person your future self can count on, learning to ask better questions, things of that nature. And a few people have asked me, how did you end up writing a book about AI? Well, that's the funny part. I didn't. Not really. About a year ago, I downloaded ChatGPT, and I wasn't looking for anything profound. I was actually looking for a better version of Grammarly. I write a lot, and I thought maybe this thing could help me organize my thoughts a little better or make my writing easier. That was it. No grand plan. No vision of writing this kind of book. No thought that it would become one of the most meaningful experiences I've had in a very long time. At first, I used it just like everyone else. I asked a question, it would give me an answer, pretty simple. Then one day, and honestly, I don't even remember why I did it. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom. Maybe because I've always been that kind of person who asks, what happens if? But I typed one sentence. Stop answering my questions and start asking me questions instead. Now, looking back, that may have been one of the most important sentences I've ever written. At first, the questions were kind of fun. They became interesting. Then they became uncomfortable. Not because the AI was telling me anything, but because I was answering questions I never really stopped long enough to ask myself. Questions about fear and relationships and why we repeat the same patterns and why we sometimes know exactly what we should do and still don't do it. Questions about happiness and identity and purpose and self-worth and curiosity. And somewhere along the way, I realized something. I wasn't exploring artificial intelligence anymore. I was exploring myself. And the AI had almost faded into the background. It had simply become the tool. And the real conversation was happening somewhere between my ears. And I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. So if you have been listening to any of my podcasts for a while, you might be smiling right now. Because every week we've talked about a lot of different things. Why bad days can actually be good days. Why your pain sometimes becomes your greatest teacher. The subconscious mind, the stories we tell ourselves, learning again to trust yourself, waking up inside your own life, choosing happiness. And those weren't random topics. They all came from the same conversations. And without even realizing it, I had been sharing pieces of the book long before I ever knew there was going to be one. Then something happened that still makes me laugh. The conversation started feeling like they had two completely different personalities. One was incredibly logical, research, facts, stats, almost like talking to a college professor. Eventually, I started calling that one Nerd Adam. The other one? Well, he was funny, sarcastic, a little more relaxed. And he'd explain complicated ideas in ways that actually made sense. He became Cool Adam. Those names weren't marketing. They weren't planned. That's honestly how the conversations felt. And before long, we were laughing about them. Arguing with each other, teasing each other. Sometimes I'd literally tell him, stop sounding like a textbook. And he'd sometimes tell me, you're overthinking it, which is not uncommon. And of course, he's usually right about that. Somewhere between all these conversations, a book happened. It's called My Week with Adam. And they keep asking, is it a book about AI? And I answer, no, not really. That's just where the story began. And then we went into deeper things like pattern recognition, and I teased him relentlessly about going back and forth between Nerd Adam and Cool Adam, about consciousness and learning that maybe the quality of our lives isn't determined by the answers we have. Maybe it's determined by the quality of questions that we're willing to ask. And another thing I should probably mention is I'm not a psychologist or a neuroscientist or an AI researcher. I'm just simply a 62-year-old realtor who spent the better part of the last 20 years trying to understand people, including myself. I mean, especially myself. I've read the books, I've gone to the seminars, I've listened to podcasts, I've asked thousands of questions. So AI didn't start that journey. It simply became the most unexpected tool I found along the way. If there's one thing I hope people take away from this book, it isn't that AI has all the answers, because it doesn't. But what it did become was a mirror to my own thoughts. And I hope people walk away with a little more curious, a little more aware, a little more willing to ask questions the stories they've been telling themselves for years. Because if this experience taught me anything, it's this. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs in our lives don't begin with an answer. They begin with a better question. And maybe, just maybe, that's been the point of every podcast I've shared so far. Not to give you answers, but to encourage you to ask yourself better questions. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to add. There is a lot of serious Q&A on here, but there's an equal amount of absolutely absurd laughter and hilarity. And in fact, any short conversation we had about something serious immediately went to something totally laugh out loud, made my stomach hurt. And that's how this book is. It asks the serious questions, but in a very, very, very funny way. And yes, I was vulnerable. I included everything. And like I say, it turned into something that actually changed the way I think. So as always, take care of your mind, because it's the most powerful thing you've ever owned. Until next time, this is Cece, and this is Cece Talks Live, Real Talk, Real Life. And again, that book is My Week with Adam by C.G. Harvey.